Federal marshals just executed seizure orders on 3 Trump Organization properties across 2 states. At 6:15 a.m. this morning, armed U.S. Marshals arrived at Trump's Westchester Golf Course, his Wall Street office building, and his Doral resort in Florida, carrying court orders authorizing immediate possession of the properties to satisfy outstanding federal judgments totaling $547 million. And look, this isn't some temporary legal hold or a fancy negotiating tactic to get him back to the table. These are permanent, aggressive asset seizures. We're talking about federal court enforcement orders that literally strip Donald Trump of his ownership rights on the spot. The control has already been handed over to government-appointed receivers. Their job: to liquidate these properties as fast as possible to settle debts that Trump has flat-out refused to pay for over 14 months. Now, think about the optics of this. When federal law enforcement shows up at the crack of dawn, with court orders to seize properties worth hundreds of millions of dollars from a former president of the United States, you know the legal system has finally run out of patience. Before we dive into exactly which properties are gone, so do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button. This story is moving fast and I'm tracking every update for you. So, how did we get to this point? What was the actual red line? Court records from the Southern District of New York show a pattern of defiance. Trump failed to satisfy 3 separate federal judgments entered between late 2024 and 2025, despite the courts practically begging him to either pay up or post an appeal bond. According to the U.S. Marshals Service, the drop-dead date was December 20th, 2025. Trump had 30 days to pay, post a bond, or prove he physically couldn't comply. When that deadline came and went with total silence from his legal team, federal judges in New York and Florida stopped playing games. They signed the orders that sent the marshals in. This isn't just a business setback. Legal experts are calling this the single most significant asset seizure from a former president in American history. It's one thing to see a headline about a court case. It's another thing entirely to see moving trucks and padlocks at properties that define your entire business empire. Here's the part you won't hear everywhere else. Tensions have been boiling over since late 2024. Trump's strategy was clear: dismiss the courts as politically motivated, and essentially dare them to do something about it. Well, in mid-December, they did. The judges determined that he wasn't just broke. He was evading. We're talking strategic property transfers, shell companies, and moves designed specifically to hide cash from the law. Let's look at the numbers, because they are staggering. First, there's the $187 million judgment from Judge Lewis Kaplan. That's from the E. Jean Carroll defamation claims. After Trump apparently couldn't stop making the same statements the court had already told him to stop making. Then, you've got $216 million from Judge Arthur Engoron. That's the interest and penalties from the New York fraud case. And finally, $144 million from Judge Aileen Cannon in Florida for what she called frivolous litigation against former officials. Add it all up, that's $547 million in debt. But here's the kicker. Court-appointed monitors found that Trump actually did have the money, or at least the ability to borrow it. He just chose not to. Records show he was moving assets into offshore accounts, transferring titles to family members, even buying expensive artwork, things that are much harder for a creditor to grab than a golf course. Smash that like button if you're starting to see the why behind this. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the defiance. On December 20th, it all came to a head in a joint teleconference. The judges told Trump's lawyers the time for accommodations was over. The lawyers argued it would cause irreparable harm to seize things before the appeals were done, but Judge Kaplan wasn't having it. He reminded them that Trump had a year to post a bond, and by failing to do that, he waived his right to delay. The judge's exact message: federal judgments are not suggestions. So, how did the marshals choose the targets? They spent 2 weeks on surveillance and discovery. They weren't looking for the most famous buildings. They were looking for the cleanest ones. Properties without massive existing loans or complex partners who could sue to stop the seizure. They landed on 3. First, Trump National Westchester, a 140-acre club worth about $180 million. Next, the crown jewel of the portfolio, 40 Wall Street. His leasehold interest there is worth about $220 million. And finally, Trump National Doral in Miami, 643 acres, 4 golf courses valued at $270 million. Together, that's $670 million in value, more than enough to cover the debt and the costs of taking them over. If you saw this coming, let me know in the comments. I'm reading through them now. The execution was clinical. On January 21st, it happened all at once. At Westchester, marshals showed up at 6:15 a.m. with a locksmith and a receiver. By 7:30, the locks were changed, electronic codes were wiped, and federal notices were taped to the clubhouse doors. Members who showed up for an early tea time were told their memberships might be honored. But the Trump Organization? They don't even have keys to the front gate anymore. At 40 Wall Street, It was even crazier. You've got dozens of commercial tenants there. The Marshals had to meet with the biggest ones to explain that their leases are still good. But their rent checks? Those go to the government now, not the Trump org. And in Miami, at Doral, there were 400 guests sleeping in their rooms when 8 deputy marshals walked in. Imagine waking up to a federal seizure notice on the lobby wall. The staff was told they still have jobs, but they don't report to Trump executives anymore. They report to a receiver. The empire didn't just stumble. It was physically taken over. Now, while the physical takeovers at Doral and Wall Street are dominating the headlines, the real story is what happened next on social media, and the massive legal trap Trump might have just walked into. At 8:47 a.m., just 2 hours after the Marshals moved in, Trump hit Truth Social, and he didn't hold back. He called the seizures an illegal attack and a coordinated strike by the Biden administration to take him out before the 2026 midterms. He actually named Judges Kaplan, Engoron, and Cannon, calling them political operatives rather than judges. But here's the problem with that warrior narrative. In a court of law, words have consequences. By claiming the seizures are illegal, he's basically signaling to the world that he intends to ignore the judicial system entirely. And for the federal government, that's like pouring gasoline on a fire. Because here is the explosive part that almost everyone is missing. This isn't just about debt anymore. The seizure orders contain specific findings that Trump engaged in fraudulent conveyance. In plain English, that means the court believes he didn't just forget to pay. They believe he deliberately hid his money to cheat his creditors. Legal experts are warning that this moves the needle from civil dispute to criminal exposure. Federal prosecutors are now looking at whether those offshore transfers and property title shifts to his kids constitute bankruptcy fraud or wire fraud. If they decide to bring charges, we aren't just talking about losing buildings. We're talking about potential jail time for a former president. Think about the precedent this sets. If the system lets a former president hide his assets and ignore court orders for over a year with no real penalty, then the law doesn't exist for the powerful. But by executing these seizures, the federal government is sending a very loud message. The rules apply to everyone, even the guy whose name is on the skyscraper. As we move into the next few months, keep your eyes on the auctions. The court-appointed receivers are going to start liquidating these properties. And the Trump organization is looking at a massive $75 million hole in their annual revenue. The empire is being dismantled, piece by piece, in broad daylight. So, what do you think? Is this accountability finally arriving, or is this persecution like Trump claims? The comment section is already blowing up, so get in there and let me know your side. And if you want to stay ahead of the next major update, make sure you've got notifications turned on, because this is only the beginning. The staff at these properties, they weren't just sent home, they were told their jobs were safe for now. But with one massive catch, they don't report to Trump executives anymore. They report to a government receiver. That is the moment the empire stopped being a family business and started being a government-controlled liquidation sale. This wasn't just another legal threat or a negotiating tactic. That would go away with a late-night phone call. This was a bombshell. And then came 8:47 a.m. Trump took to Truth Social, and the post was a total blast. He called the whole thing an illegal attack, orchestrated by judges in the Biden administration to derail his 2026 campaign. He went after the judges, Kaplan, Engoron, and Cannon by name, calling them political operatives and Washington establishment thugs. He even called on patriotic Americans to rally to his defense. But when a former president tells his followers that federal court orders are illegal and calls for resistance, that's not just a social media post. That's a direct challenge to the entire U.S. legal system. Here's the thing. Trump's claim that the Marshals have no authority falls apart the second you look at the paperwork. This wasn't one rogue judge, it was 3 separate federal courts, all acting because of a documented year-long pattern of dodging payments. And if you think this is unprecedented, well, the targets are, but the process isn't. Think back to 2013 and R. Allen Stanford. He tried to hide $7 billion in a massive Ponzi scheme using offshore accounts and complex shell companies. The feds didn't just ask for the money back, they sent in the Marshals and seized everything from his office buildings to his personal house to pay back the victims, or look at Bernie Madoff in 2008. The Marshals took his Manhattan penthouse, his beach houses, even his yacht and his jewelry. The message in those cases was clear. It doesn't matter how much money you have or what your status is. If you refuse to comply with a court order, the government will eventually just come and take the keys. But this Trump situation, it's on a different level. This is the first time we've seen this happen to a former president. And if the system lets someone ignore a judgment just because they have political support, the whole legal structure collapses. So, what is the actual law here? Experts say this falls under standard debt collection statutes. It's the same process used in thousands of cases every year. If you don't pay and you don't post a bond, the creditor can execute the judgment. Jennifer Taub, a law professor who literally wrote the book on financial fraud, pointed out that Trump was actually given extraordinary patience. Most people would have had their bank accounts garnished months ago. Seizure is the remedy of last resort. The court only does this when every other option has failed. But here is the kicker. That should keep Trump's legal team up at night. Fraudulent conveyance. The court didn't just say he didn't pay. They found that he was deliberately moving money to family members and shell companies specifically to keep it out of the reach of the law. Under federal law, the government can claw back those assets. That means even the money Trump thought he safely moved to his kids or offshore accounts, it's not safe. The court can void those transfers and add them to the pile for seizure. Don't go anywhere, because the legal battle over these clawbacks is about to get very, very ugly. Now let's talk about the precedent trap. That should have every high-level executive in the Trump organization checking their bank accounts twice. When the Marshals seize a property under a federal judgment, they aren't just there to take the keys and walk away. They are setting up a receivership. In plain English, Uncle Sam just fired the board of directors. The staff at Doral and Westchester were told they still have jobs, but their paychecks are now being cut by a court-appointed boss. This is the moment it stops being a legal battle and starts being a total corporate takeover. Think back to the Bernie Madoff or Alan Stanford takedowns. Those guys tried the same shell game. Moves, hiding cash in offshore tax havens and shuffling titles between family members. But once the Marshals moved in, the courts hit the undo button. See, because the judges found evidence of fraudulent conveyance, which that's the legal term for shuffling the deck to cheat your creditors, they can now go after anything Trump touched in the last year. That artwork he bought, the money he gifted to his kids, under federal law, the government can claw back those assets as if the transfers never happened. Trump might think he's shielded his inner circle, but the feds are coming for the receipts. And let's be real for a second. Trump's response on Truth Social, calling the judges hacks, and the Marshals illegal, that's a classic distract and deflect play. But in a court of law, that kind of rhetoric is a total nothing burger. It doesn't stop the auction. It doesn't stop the appraisers. In fact, by calling for resistance, he might just be handing prosecutors a silver platter of evidence for criminal contempt. This is the first time in American history we've seen the organized crime playbook, the same one used to dismantle mob bosses, being used against a former president's business empire. So what's the real skinny? The law doesn't care about your fan club or your 2026 campaign trail. It cares about enforcement. If you ignore a federal judgment for 14 months, eventually the big dog shows up at your door with a locksmith and a moving truck. The empire isn't just stumbling. It's being audited in real time by the most powerful law enforcement agency on the planet. If you want to stay ahead of the next major update, like which property is hitting the auction block first, make sure you've got notifications turned on. This is Accountability 101, and class is officially in session. Now, strap in, because the most explosive part is coming next. And honestly, this should be a massive wake-up call for anyone who cares about the rule of law in this country. This isn't just about Trump cutting a check or settling some old beef. If a former president can just blow off federal court orders for over a year while shuffling the deck with his assets to duck a collection and face zero consequences, it sends a signal that if you've got enough political juice, the law doesn't apply to you. Once that door is open, there's no closing it. It tells every future president that judicial authority is just a suggestion, that court orders are optional for anyone who can stir up enough noise to call it persecution. This puts Trump's business and his campaign in a brutal pincer move. On one side, he's watching three of his most legendary properties, Doral, 40 Wall Street, and Westchester, get yanked away by the feds. We're talking about an estimated $75 million in annual revenue just vanishing from the Trump org's books. No more golf memberships, no more resort bookings, no more rent checks. That is a massive gaping hole in his cash flow. But on the other side, he's got to look his voters in the eye and explain how a master dealmaker lost control of his empire because he couldn't or wouldn't follow the same rules as every other American. And here is the real skinny. There is no good way out of this for him. Either he admits he's tapped out and couldn't find a lender to back his bonds, which torpedoes his billionaire brand, or he admits he had the cash but just chose to flip the bird to the court. Either way, it's a self-inflicted disaster. Legal heavyweights like Bradley P. Moss and Norman Eisen are calling this a watershed moment. Trump spent decades operating on the idea that rules are for the little guys and that he could always delay and pray his way out of trouble. But the Marshals showing up proves that even if you're the former leader of the free world, when the court's patience runs out, the hammer drops. Even Chris Christie, who isn't exactly a fan of these cases, had to keep it real. He told ABC News that when you shell game your assets to avoid paying what you owe, a seizure is exactly what should happen. It's equal justice 101. So let's break down the damage. The business hit. He just lost $670 million in assets and $75 million in yearly cash. His borrowing power, basically toast. No serious bank wants to touch a guy whose buildings are being run by government-appointed receivers. The reputation hit. His billionaire status is under a microscope. If he's as loaded as he says, why couldn't he secure a bond? It suggests his empire is either a house of cards or so buried in debt that no lender would take his property as collateral. And while his supporters are calling this government overreach, and some GOP members are even calling for investigations into the judges, the law is pretty black and white here. Jennifer Taub, a law professor who's a total pro on financial fraud, pointed out that the court showed insane levels of patience. This is the same debt collection 101 used in thousands of cases. The only difference? This time the deadbeat is a former president. But the kicker, the part that should have his team sweating bullets, is the finding of fraudulent conveyance. By shuffling the deck and moving assets to his kids or offshore entities, he didn't just delay the debt, he potentially walked right into a criminal trap. Federal prosecutors are now looking at whether this asset shifting constitutes bankruptcy fraud or wire fraud. We aren't just talking about a civil fine anymore. We're talking about the big dog. Prosecutors looking for a felony. The system cannot function if the powerful can just ignore the law. If there are no consequences for this level of defiance, then the law is just a nothing burger. For the elite, slam that like button if you think the law should apply to everyone, regardless of the name on the building. Stick with me. Because what happens when these properties hit the auction block is going to change the real estate game forever. Now let's get down to the real talk. Because what's happening at these properties right now is absolute insanity. We aren't just talking about a change in ownership on some dusty piece of paper in a courthouse. This is a full-blown boots-on-the-ground takeover. Imagine being a guest at the Doral Resort in Miami. You wake up, head down for breakfast, and find federal seizure notices plastered all over the lobby. The staff? They're still there, but they've been given the new reality talk. They no longer report to the Trump family. They report to a government-appointed receiver. That is the moment the Trump brand officially lost the keys to the kingdom. Over at the Westchester Golf Course, members, some of the wealthiest people in New York, were literally turned away at the gate. The message was loud and clear: the feds are in charge now. And if you think this is just political theater, you're missing the precedent trap that just snapped shut. See, by shuffling the deck with his assets, moving titles to his kids and tucking cash into offshore accounts, Trump didn't just delay the bill. He handed the Department of Justice a roadmap for a criminal case. The court already made a finding of fraudulent conveyance. In the legal world, that's like catching someone red-handed trying to hide the loot before the cops arrive. This is where the master dealmaker narrative hits a brick wall. Any competent business operator would have secured a bond through a standard lender. The fact that Trump couldn't or wouldn't suggests one of two things. Either he's not nearly as liquid, as he's been bragging about for decades, or his properties are so buried in debt that no bank in America would touch them as collateral. Either way, it's a self-inflicted catastrophe. As Norman Eisen, the guy who literally wrote the book on ethics in the White House, put it, this is a watershed moment for American accountability. For 40 years, Trump has used delay and pray tactics to stay one step ahead of the law. He gambled that the courts wouldn't have the guts to actually seize a former president's empire. He lost that gamble spectacularly. And don't think for a second the big dog lenders aren't watching this. Major banks are already scouring their loan agreements for material adverse change clauses. If they decide these seizures trigger a default, we could see a domino effect that levels the rest of the Trump organization's portfolio. So, what's the bottom line here? The American legal system is being tested in a way we haven't seen since the days of the RICO mob takedowns. If a powerful politician can ignore a court order for 14 months and face no real heat, the law is a joke. But by sending in the Marshals with locksmiths and moving trucks, the system is proving that at the end of the day, the house always wins. If this situation is blowing your mind, you need to stay tuned, because the auction for 40 Wall Street is going to be the real estate event of the century. Now, let's get down to the real talk. Because what's happening at these properties right now is absolute insanity. We aren't just talking about a change in ownership on some dusty piece of paper in a courthouse. This is a full-blown boots-on-the-ground takeover. Imagine being a guest at the Doral Resort in Miami. You wake up, head down for breakfast, and find federal seizure notices plastered all over the lobby. The staff? They're still there, but they've been given the new reality talk. They no longer report to the Trump family. They report to a government-appointed receiver. That is the moment the Trump brand officially lost the keys to the kingdom. Over at the Westchester Golf Course, members, some of the wealthiest people in New York, were literally turned away at the gate. The message was loud and clear: the feds are in charge now. And if you think this is just political theater, you're missing the precedent trap that just snapped shut. The clawback trap: no asset is safe. See, by shuffling the deck with his assets, moving titles to his kids and tucking cash into offshore accounts, Trump didn't just delay the bill. He handed the Department of Justice a roadmap for a criminal case. The court already made a finding of fraudulent conveyance. In the legal world, that's like catching someone red-handed trying to hide the loot before the cops arrive. Under Title 11 and the Uniform Voidable Transactions Act, the government doesn't just stop at the buildings they already found. They can reach back 2 years and claw back any money or property Trump gifted or sold for less than market value. That fancy artwork? Those family trusts? If the court says they were moved to dodge a debt, the Marshals can go get them. This is where the master dealmaker narrative hits a brick wall. Any competent business operator would have secured a bond through a standard lender. The fact that Trump couldn't or wouldn't suggests one of two things. Either he's not nearly as liquid, as he's been bragging about for decades, or his properties are so buried in debt that no bank in America would touch them as collateral. The $75 million cash flow hole. Financially, this is a straight-up heart attack for the Trump organization. Analysts estimate these three properties alone brought in roughly $75 million in annual revenue. That cash didn't just go to Trump's pocket, it paid for the lawyers, the jets, and the operating costs of the entire empire. With that cash flow diverted to a government receiver, the rest of the business starts to starve. It creates a material adverse change, a legal trigger that allows other banks to call in their loans immediately. We could be looking at a domino effect, where every lender from Deutsche Bank to local Florida credit unions starts demanding their money back all at once. Accountability or persecution? As Norman Eisen, the guy who literally wrote the book on ethics in the White House, put it, this is a watershed moment for American accountability. For 40 years, Trump has used delay and pray tactics to stay one step ahead of the law. He gambled that the courts wouldn't have the guts to actually seize a former president's empire. He lost that gamble spectacularly. Even Chris Christie had to keep it real, stating that when you refuse to pay court judgments, seizure is exactly what should happen. It's equal justice 101. If the system lets a billionaire ignore a $547 million bill while a regular American gets their car repossessed over a few missed payments, then the law is a joke. So, what's the bottom line here? The American legal system is being tested in a way we haven't seen since the days of the RICO mob takedowns. If a powerful politician can ignore a court order for 14 months and face no real heat, the system is broken. But by sending in the Marshals with locksmiths and moving trucks, the system is proving that at the end of the day, the house always wins. The empire isn't just stumbling. It's being audited in real time by the most powerful law enforcement agency on the planet. If this situation is blowing your mind, you need to stay tuned, because the auction for 40 Wall Street is going to be the real estate event of the century. Slam that like button if you think the law should apply to everyone. From the penthouse to the pavement, I'll be tracking every single move the Marshals make, so make sure your notifications are on. This is Accountability 101, and the feds just rang the bell.